I need to tell you something I have never said out loud, and I need you to understand that what I am about to describe is not grief talking. It is not confusion. It is the documented legal truth of what my husband was for 31 years while I thought I knew him. He had another family, a woman, 2 children, 19 years. I am a widow. My husband's name does not matter for this story. What matters is that he died in February, that I buried him in the coat I helped him choose, that I arranged the flowers and wrote the order of service and stood at the door of the church, shaking hands with people who said he was a good man, and that 6 weeks later, a letter arrived from a solicitor I had never heard of on behalf of a woman I will call Sandra, informing me that she was making a claim against my husband's estate under the Inheritance, Provision for Family and Dependents, Act 1975. Sandra had been with him since I was 38 years old. Her younger child was 17, her older one was 21. They had a house together in a town 40 minutes away that I had never been to, and she had 19 years of photographs and messages, and what she described as a common law partnership that entitled her to a share of an estate I had spent 31 years helping to build. I sat in the kitchen with that letter for 2 hours. The kitchen smelled of the coffee I had made and not drunk. The radiator ticked. I did not move. Let me tell you what I knew and what I did not know, because the gap between those two things is the whole story. I knew my husband worked away a great deal. He was in facilities management, which requires travel, and I had never questioned the pattern because the pattern had always been there. I did not know that the travel was structured around a second life in a second town with a second set of obligations he had been maintaining for 2 decades. I did not know that he had, at some point between marrying me in 1992 and dying in February of this year, entered into a relationship with Sandra that she had understood to be permanent and exclusive. I did not know she existed. She apparently did not know about me either. 2 minutes in and I need to stop and ask you something. When the person you have been with for 31 years dies and you discover that he had been lying for 20 of them, what do you grieve? Do you grieve the man you thought he was, knowing he did not exist? Do you grieve the marriage you thought you had, knowing it was built on a fraud? Do you grieve the years, the ordinary Tuesday evenings and the Sunday mornings and the anniversaries, knowing that while you were living them, he was somewhere else, being someone else for someone else? I have not answered this question. I am not sure it has an answer. What I can tell you is that the grief I felt after the letter arrived was different from the grief I felt after the funeral, and the second kind was worse. My solicitor was a woman called Frances, contentious probate specialist, with the particular quality of someone who has sat across the table from devastated people so many times that she has developed a very precise and practical form of compassion. Frances told me 3 things in our first meeting. First, that a claim under the Inheritance Act, which is the mechanism by which someone not included in a will can ask the court to make provision for them from an estate, required Sandra to demonstrate that she had been financially dependent on my husband, or that reasonable financial provision had not been made for her. Second, that the existence of a long-term parallel relationship did not in itself entitle Sandra to a share of the estate, but that the court would consider the nature and length of the relationship when assessing her claim. Third, that there was a further complication I was not yet aware of. The complication. Frances had obtained the registry records. My husband had registered our marriage in 1992. He had also, it appeared, registered a second marriage, not a civil partnership, a legal marriage, to Sandra in 2003, 11 years into our marriage. He had married her in a registry office 40 miles away without divorcing me first. A bigamous marriage. Which meant Sandra's marriage was legally void, which meant she had not known she was not legally married to a man she had believed was her husband for 19 years, which meant that the emotional devastation in this story was not mine alone to carry, and I had to hold that truth alongside everything else, which is the most exhausting thing I have ever had to do. This is the midpoint. This is where the stakes doubled, because the legal picture was now not simply an Inheritance Act claim, but a case that involved the Criminal Law Act 1977, which makes bigamy a criminal offence and a dead man against whom no prosecution could now be brought, and 2 women who had both been deceived, and an estate that was simultaneously the subject of a civil claim and evidence of a criminal act for which there would be no criminal accountability. The care home worker was a woman called Moira, quiet, methodical, and possessed of the specific moral courage of someone who writes things down because she believes truth should be recorded. Moira had worked at the care home where my husband spent his final 6 weeks, admitted following a stroke that left him unable to make decisions or communicate reliably. She had kept a log, as was standard practice. Her log contained entries about visitors. My husband had been visited by 2 women on separate occasions during those 6 weeks. Both visits were logged. Both visitors had identified themselves to staff. Both names were in the record. Sandra had been there. I had been there. Neither of us had known the other existed. We had visited on different days in the same ward, sitting beside the same man who had been incapable of the deception he had practiced for 20 years and who died without ever being asked to account for it. The witness testimony flip came at the hearing in October. Sandra's barrister presented her as a woman who had believed herself to be legally married, who had been financially dependent on my husband, and who had been left entirely unprovided for in a will she had not known about. He argued that the void marriage did not negate her dependence or her reasonable expectation of provision, and that the court should exercise its discretion under the Inheritance Act accordingly. Sandra herself gave evidence. She was composed and specific and clearly devastated. She described 19 years of what she had believed to be a committed marriage. She described financial arrangements that made her dependent on my husband's income. She described his final weeks and her visits, and the moment she had learned, from a nurse who did not know the full picture, that another woman had also been visiting. And then Francis cross-examined her on one specific point. Francis asked Sandra whether, in the course of their 19 years together, my husband had ever told her he had been married before. Sandra said no. Francis asked whether he had ever mentioned a previous relationship of significance. Sandra said no. Francis asked whether, when she had applied to register their marriage in 2003, she had been asked whether either party had been previously married, and whether my husband had answered that question truthfully in her presence. Sandra paused. She said she had not been present when the forms were completed. She said my husband had handled the paperwork. She said she had signed what was put in front of her. She had not known she was signing a void document. She had not known any of it. The judge found that Sandra was entitled to some provision from the estate. The court has discretion under the Inheritance Act, and the length and nature of her dependency was genuine regardless of the legal void in the marriage. The provision awarded was £38,000 from an estate valued at £260,000. I retained the rest. Francis described this as a reasonable outcome. I understand what she means. I hold it in my hands like something that ought to feel like a victory and does not quite get there. The costly part is not the £38,000. The costly part is what I know now that I cannot unknow. 31 years is not just a number, it is the texture of a life, the particular smell of someone's coat, the sound of a key in a door, the specific weight of the ordinary. I had all of that. I thought I knew what it meant. I was wrong about what it meant, and the wrongness does not invalidate the texture or the smell or the sound or the weight, but it changes what those things are evidence of, and I do not yet know how to live with a revised version of my own past. What would you do with 31 years that turned out to be something other than what you thought they were? I am still working out what they are to me now. I may be working it out for the rest of my life.